campaign plan, in many ways, I describe as sort of the GPS of the campaign. And the metaphor here is, if you were going on a journey or a car trip, you wouldn't get in the car, start driving, and then about halfway through the time that you think it takes you to get to where you're going, pull over and put the GPS or put the final location into your GPS. You would, before you started driving, put in your destination, get a full scope of where you're going, potentially even map out of places that you're going to stop along the way. That way, you know that you're progressing in the right direction. And too often, campaigns don't do that. They just get out of the gates and start running, not even certain, what direction they're running towards. And this is a moment where I think people will look back and say, I really should have taken more time to map things out. And that's what the campaign plan ultimately is intending to solve. Part of that is answering questions, and each piece of the campaign plan is intended to answer one very specific question. So, for example, the communication section is answering the question of how do I, as a candidate, craft a winning and persuasive message that's going to resonate with voters. Your path to victory section answers that question of how many and where the votes a candidate needs to win comes from. Basically, how many votes do I need to win, and how do I even figure that out? Your voter contacts tactics part of the plan is the next step of how do I execute? So, what do I need to actually do in order to achieve my path to victory? And finally, your timeline is what are those key dates? What are those milestones on the journey where I need to take stock of if I'm moving in the right direction? And how will I even be able to measure my progress? We'll start with the communications plan, which unsurprisingly is very much how do I plan out and map how I spread my why to other people? So it very much is your comms plan is almost always a reflection of your why statement. And how do you ground your campaign in your why, regardless of kind of what issue you're talking about or what it is that you're telling people about yourself? How does it always come back to your core mission and motivation? There are some best practices here. Certainly, a campaign wants to be, values driven. Campaign communications should be clear and unambiguous and easy to understand. They should be consistent and disciplined, which is an area that you'll hear campaign managers if you bring one on, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But a campaign manager's job oftentimes is to be talking message discipline, and what that means is that even if it feels like you're sticking to a script and might even be acting kind of a little bit like a robot, it's important to understand that most people aren't interacting with a candidate on more than a handful of occasions, if that, right? It's not uncommon for a campaign to meet one voter one time. And if the candidate is trying every different stop or every different event to be the candidate that they want that specific group to be, that means 5 different groups or 10 different groups or whoever is meeting the candidate is meeting a different person potentially many times a day. And those candidates tend to struggle because they haven't uh, controlled the experience. They haven't made sure that everyone is meeting the same person. Obviously, a message has to be issues oriented. And again, how do those issues relate to the campaign's why in a way that is connected to the needs and the concerns of people in the community? And that speaks to the last point on this slide, right? Every election is ultimately an exercise in asking voters a choice to make a choice, and that choice is based on, are things going well, or do I want to make a change? And for most people who are running specifically as independents, oftentimes it's the latter. Why is it so important that we offer an alternative vision to the one that we have? If you're an incumbent, it's the contrast there, right? It's the opposite. Things are going really well, and I think I deserve to continue doing the job that I'm doing. So what you're looking at on this screen is what's called a Tully box, and it's a classical political tool that helps candidates and campaigns map out sort of the full scope of what a political message looks like. And you'll see that it's split into 4 sections. I like to think of it as sort of 2 halves, the left half and the right half. And each box is intended to prepare your candidate on how to define the race in terms favorable to them and or how to anticipate what your opponent might be doing. So the left side of the box is what we'll say both about ourselves, how we'll define our own campaign and our own candidate in terms that are most favorable to them, and how we will define our opponent in terms that, again, are favorable to us. Like, how do we frame the potentially vulnerabilities or weaknesses of our opponent and contrast that and frame them as strengths of ours? And similarly, on the other side, the opponent is doing the same thing. They're trying to position themselves in the most favorable light possible and identify and understand the weaknesses of their opponents and use that as part of their own why statement and their own argument for contrast. This is something that we stress is an important piece of the campaign. It might be a little uncomfortable or awkward to sort of think of yourself or ask others to define what your own weaknesses or vulnerabilities might be as a candidate. Everyone has them, and it's important to be able to look at that, holistically and prepare yourself for what's coming so that you can react, so that you can reframe the debate, so that you can maneuver and position yourself to say, "Hey, look, this is why what that person's saying, is not necessarily supposed to be something that is going to define the race." And when this is not done correctly, the consequences can be significant.